waiting for the coffee to come. How do you like that?
Ooh, thank you. I should have asked that, shouldn't I?
We keep some here. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Betsy and Walter Stern Conference Center here at Hudson Institute. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute, and I'm delighted that we have a capacity crowd on what is a rainy Monday here in Washington after the Thanksgiving holiday for the latest installation of our Ambassador Series, which features leading figures on Embassy Row in conversation with Hudson Institute's Ravenel B. III Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship, Walter Russell Mead. I want to also acknowledge the presence of our good friends in the C-SPAN viewing audience, and we appreciate all the work that C-SPAN does to bring our policy work and the policy work of our fellow think tanks to people around the country, especially at this critical time. We at Hudson are especially delighted as well to welcome the British Ambassador to the United States, Sir Kim Darroch, here to Hudson Institute for a discussion that could hardly be more timely given developments back home, developments in Brussels over this weekend. This has been yet another absolutely extraordinary week in the debate over Brexit, and we look forward to the Ambassador's observation shortly. Hudson Institute's mission is to promote U.S. international leadership and global engagement for a secure, free, and prosperous future. Central to our work is promoting a great deal of work on U.S.-European relations. We have various initiatives on U.S.-EU relations, U.S.-German relations, U.S.-French relations, relations with the Baltics, the Scandinavian nations, Finland, among others. And we have a very long history of work on the UK and the UK-US relationship, including that of our senior fellow, Erwin Stelzer, who is based for many years in London. Our work today on U.S.-UK relations is led by senior fellow Craig Kennedy, the former president of the German Marshall Fund. And I'm delighted to note within that context that Hudson Institute, in partnership with our friends, the Henry Jackson Society, will be holding a bilateral and bipartisan Congress Parliament workshop in mid-December in Oxford. Now, of course, no one is better suited in Washington to give us a better sense of the current dynamics over Brexit, the future of UK-EU relations and UK-US relations than Ambassador Darroch. He has held many of the United Kingdom's leading diplomatic posts, including serving as National Security Advisor to then Prime Minister David Cameron, where he handled such thorny issues as the rise of ISIS in Syria and Iraq and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Prior to serving as National Security Advisor, Sir Kim was the UK permanent representative to the EU from 2007 to 2011, most notably during the Eurozone crisis. And prior to that period, he was the EU advisor to the Prime Minister. Sir Kim, of course, will be in conversation with Walter Russell Mead, the Dean of Observers of U.S. Foreign Policy. Walter's Global View column in the Wall Street Journal is the most widely read foreign policy column today in the United States. His numerous books, of course, include the award-winning Of God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World, about the Anglo-American tradition of world power from the 17th century to the present. Without any further ado, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Walter.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks for being here. And again, welcome to all the folks watching on C-SPAN, as well as all the people in the hall. Sir Kim, Ambassador Darroch, what do you prefer?
Just Kim is fine.
All right. Well, I think the question that everybody wants to get an answer to these days is what's going on with Brexit. We seem to have a Schrodinger's Brexit. We're not sure whether Britain is going to be in or out of the EU or what's going to happen, I guess, December 12th. So can you tell me what the state of play is?
Yeah. I thought we might do other subjects rather than Brexit today, actually, but just joking. Look, what the Prime Minister has negotiated, and I think it's an exceptional achievement, and I say that having done 15 years of my career on European Union work, is she has delivered what the British people voted for, which is an orderly, smooth exit from the European Union on the basis of this deal. It's a deal which delivers what the British people voted for back in June 2016. It provides for regaining control of our borders, of our money, and of our laws. But it also, with this transitional, or more correctly, implementation period, which lasts from the day we leave, 29 March 2019, until the end of December 2020, so a sort of 19-20 month period, when for the business community, everything will remain as it is, and they have that continuity and that assurance of continuity through that time while we negotiate the details of the future relationship. But it also provides for us to continue to cooperate with the EU in areas which are of benefit to us, whether it's economic or national security or foreign policy or data exchange. So in the sense of trying to find, and remember, the Brexit vote was quite close. I mean, it was 17 and a bit million to 16 million, 52% to 48%. So the Prime Minister's had to try to find a balance between those who are concerned about the impact of Brexit and those who are enthusiastic about it. And I think she's found it. And, you know, as Jean-Claude Juncker said at the conclusion of the European Council yesterday, this is the best deal that can be done. And so he hopes that it gets the support of the British Parliament in December, as do I.
How does that look?
Look, at the moment, it looks, I mean, she has got, first of all, support from her cabinet. That was about 10, 12 days ago. She has now got support from the other 27 European Union leaders. This is the third stage. It's the most difficult stage. And no one would deny that it looks quite a tightrope to get across, to get this vote in Parliament. But if you're a strong supporter of Brexit and you vote against this deal, you are risking no Brexit. You're essentially letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. If you are a strong supporter of Remain and you vote against this deal, then you are risking a no-deal, hard Brexit, which most observers believe would be highly disruptive, if not chaotic, and could be quite damaging to the economy. So this is the right way through. So yes, it looks at the moment like, if you're a journalist, having quite a lot of fun now finding people who say they're going to vote against. But when they come then I think you'll find quite a lot of people actually think this is the best way forward. So it's difficult, it's going to be tense, but I was back in London last week, as it happens, and they are confident inside the government that they can get a majority for this.
By very cleverly having an unwritten constitution, Britain makes it hard for foreigners to figure out where things are going. But if the government were to lose the vote on Brexit, is that the kind of vote that normally breaks up a government and you get an election or a new prime minister?
I mean, what the government is carefully avoiding saying is what they will do were the vote to be lost. So I'm afraid I can't announce any great sort of way forward plan B now. The intention is very much to win the vote and to persuade enough MPs between now and then who are thinking about their positions that their best route forward is support this. By the way, there was an opinion poll over the weekend that suggests there's quite a lot of public support, a majority of public support for the deal that the Prime Minister has done. And so if you are representing constituents, which MPs are doing, then you might think quite carefully about where the public view is. But I mean, as a technical matter, if the government lost the vote, then they would have to decide where to go next, whether to proceed to leaving without a deal, which is an option, or whether to ask for an extension or find some other way forward. But there is nothing I can say about what they would do, because that, as I say, isn't the plan.
Would they need to have another vote in Parliament before a hard exit, or do they just, if they do nothing and the date for Brexit arrives, then the UK is out of the EU without a vote?
Yeah, this is all a bit speculative, and I'm no expert on parliamentary procedure, but I don't. It's not obvious to me if this vote were lost and if the government decided that leaving without a deal was the way forward. Whether that it's not clear to me that needs a further vote in Parliament. But as I say, this is speculative, and I couldn't claim that's a definitive answer. You'd probably get different answers if you asked a dozen MPs. You get a dozen different answers on that. So.
Now, one of the key issues in the negotiations as they went forward was the question of the Irish border. And that's particularly politically tricky, I understand, because the government depends on a Northern Irish Unionist party. By the way, for Americans, a Unionist party means they're in favor of union with the United Kingdom, not in favor of union with the rest of Ireland. So how has that party's weight in politics affected things? And I gather they right now seem very skeptical of the deal.
Well, I think they have 10 members of Parliament, and they were in an informal agreement to support the government. So obviously those are 10 significant votes, given how tight things are in Parliament. But the Prime Minister has really made exceptional efforts to deliver a deal which does what she promised, which is no re-establishment of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. That was her promise, and that is what she has delivered. And it's been controversial within her own party, amongst her own supporters, but she has done it. So she has absolutely gone to the edge to deliver on what she has promised on that. And you now have, in the transitional period, the implementation period, while we stay basically within a customs arrangement with the EU, there will be no need for a hard border or any re-establishment of border controls in Northern Ireland. The intention is, in that 19-month period, that we will do a deal with the EU that keeps trade as frictionless as possible. And I have to put it in those terms because we also want to do free trade deals with the rest of the world. So we have to find a balance going forward on that. But we think we can do a trade deal with the EU that keeps trade as frictionless as possible and means a minimum of controls on borders. That would keep the border open. But if we can't do that deal in the implementation period, this 19 months, then you have the famous backstop, which essentially will allow these, it's a temporary thing, to stress that it's temporary, the backstop, but will allow these arrangements to continue until we have done that trade deal. But it's in both sides' interests to do a trade deal. EU sells a lot of stuff to us and we do in the other direction. So I would be confident that we would do the deal, hopefully within the implementation period. And the question of needing the backstop or using the backstop won't arise.
Well, let's assume that things go roughly as planned and that Brexit goes through. Then presumably Britain will need a foreign policy for post-Brexit. And you talk about free trade agreements. Presumably Britain will want some kind of free trade agreement or trade agreement with the United States. What would that look like? What is Britain hoping to achieve?
Yeah. On foreign policy generally, Walter, I mean, remember that we are permanent members of the Security Council. We're the second biggest contributors to NATO. We have a leadership role in the Commonwealth. We will continue to cooperate on foreign policy and national union. We are global players in terms of defense. We have military people, often in very small numbers, but stationed in dozens of countries around the world. So we feel we are good global players, and the intention is that that will continue, if not be enhanced in the future. I mean, that's the bigger vision. In terms of a free trade deal with the US, we want, as we've said, and as the US administration has echoed, an ambitious deal which covers both goods and services, which exploits the similarities in our two economies which increases what is already a very, very big amount of bilateral trade, something like 200 billion a year, and we send more than 20% of our exports to the US. So it's already the biggest single bilateral trading relationship, but it can be much bigger. And that should ultimately, we hope, involve improved no tariff, no quota access for goods from us coming from the UK coming to the US and vice versa, and hopefully the removal of barriers on services as well. So as ambitious as we can get.
What about people? Certainly a lot of American bankers are in London and others, but I know immigration is migration sensitive in both countries.
Yeah. I mean, the post-Brexit immigration arrangements, we know broadly where the direction we are going in, but the detail still has to be finalized. But the likelihood is, after Brexit, the profile of our immigration, we still are a country that will have people coming in because we need them for our workforce. But the profile may change, so it will be fewer from Europe and more from the rest of the world. But in terms of the American companies that are invested in a very valuable part of the British economy, who talk to us about their concerns about needing to be able to bring the best and the brightest in, certainly it's our intention that should continue to be the case. And we tell these companies that we value their presence in the UK, we want them to stay, we want them to expand, and we will adopt immigration policies that give them the kind of supply of talent that they need.
Right. Is the U.S.-U.K. relationship, from what you can see, still special? And if so, what makes it different?
Yeah, I mean, you can debate over whether the word special is the one you want to use, or I can just tell you that it is both exceptionally, uniquely wide and deep. So whether you look at trade, where the US is certainly our biggest export market, whether you look at inward investment, where 1 million Brits go to work in American companies in the UK, and 1 million Americans go to work in British companies over here. If you look at culture, I'm just fascinated by just how many British actors seem to find employment in Hollywood. Maybe fewer American actors come over to the UK, but they're very welcome. So
I notice that the British often play villains in Revolutionary War movies.
That used to be the case, but I just remember a British actor playing Martin Luther King in Selma a few years back, and that's about as iconic a role as you can imagine. So when we've managed to get that kind of level, then I think we're doing okay. And that's before you get into military relationship, where there is just a huge amount going on. We are buying something like $50 billion worth of US equipment over the next decade, 138 F-35s, 50 Apache helicopters, 9 P-8 maritime patrol aircraft. There's the whole cooperation on our nuclear weapon program. There are something like 800 or 900 Brits embedded in the US Armed Forces at any one time. We have dozens of projects going on all the time in terms of cooperation on weapon systems. National security and intelligence, the relationship between the intelligence security agencies is closer than it's ever been now. Look at that across the whole breadth of the relationship, and it is exceptional and unique. So I think the word special is appropriate.
I think one challenge that must give you personally is when Washington is as polarized as it is, and American politics are bitter in many ways. As someone who wants to maintain, Britain has a long history of working effectively with both parties in the United States. How do you manage to keep your channels open and communications clear with both parties?
To be honest, excuse me. To be honest, Walter, it really isn't a problem. At least it hasn't been in my 2.5 years here. We find open doors and a welcome on both sides of the political aisle. I spend 2 afternoons a week, whenever Congress is in session, visiting and meeting senators and congressmen, members of the House of Representatives. I always do a combination of Republicans and Democrats, and we get a welcome in both sides. We have, if you've been to it, if you haven't, we'll invite you. The residence is built for large parties, and we have a lot of them. And again, we always make them bipartisan, and we find both sides of the political spectrum come. So, as British ambassador and as British mission, I tell you, it is no problem. I recognise what you say because I read about it a lot. That politics is particularly partisan here, but for the Brits, we're getting a welcome on both sides.
All right, maybe that's a bipartisan consensus in favor of Scotch whiskey. Don't know, but it's good to hear. After Brexit, you're going to have a lot of complicated issues with the EU and the Eurozone still. You'll have a large economic relationship. How is Britain going to manage that portfolio? Will it be primarily through the representative in Brussels, through national missions? How are you going to manage it?
It's a good question. And certainly we will need a substantial, I headed the UK representation in Brussels for 5 years. And it's quite a large mission. Here is larger, but it's quite a large mission. And I don't think it's going to be much smaller post-exit. I looked across at countries that were outside the EU, including, by the way, your US mission, and they were all quite sizable because there's a lot to cover. And with a kind of, close and cooperative relationship that we want with our European partners post-Brexit, I think we'll need to have quite a lot of people there. But we are also in the process of expanding somewhat our bilateral embassies in most of the main EU member states. So there'll be a big role for diplomacy, both bilaterally and with the multilateral institution in terms of the EU post-Brexit. It's not just, of course, the Commission that you need to talk to. You need to talk to the other member states to try and influence decisions that are taken. You need to talk to the European Parliament and the other institutions. So it's a big job.
We're seeing the sort of emergence, and there have always been some factions in the EU, but it appears both that the different political parties in the Parliament are becoming stronger, but also you're getting groups of countries, the Visegrad types, the new Hanseatic countries. People seem to be organizing in different ways. Is that something? And obviously, some of these groups will have positions more in sync with British ideas.
Yeah.
Is this going to be going to play a role in how Britain thinks?
I think, well, honestly, that it's long been a feature of the EU, particularly the expanded EU, the 27 members that were the reality when I was ambassador to the EU, 28 now with Croatia. There's long been this these subgroupings. They tend to be quite fluid, by the way, because you get subgroupings around issues. Every time the EU budget negotiations come up, those member states that are basically contributors to the budget, as we are at the moment, tend to form one group, and those who are mainly recipients from the budget tend to form another. You get geographical groupings, as you've described. You've always had that particular alliance between France and Germany, the kind of Franco-German motor in the EU. We used to work very closely, and still do, we're members with the Nordic countries and with the Netherlands. But all of these things are fluid and can change. They can be issues-based, as I say, or geographically based. And in the end, when you go to a European Council, you need everyone to agree to the conclusions. So however you have organized your discussions up to that point, in the end, everyone has a say. By the way, also on political groupings, you find, or on EU groupings, you find political groupings. So the right-wing parties are part of the European People's Party, and the left-wing is part of the European Socialist Party. And there are other smaller groups there as well. So there's a whole range of different formations.
That certainly has been.
Sorry, I'm such an EU geek, having done 15 years of my career. I've gone forever about this stuff.
Oh, but studying divisions in Europe has long been a core British skill.
Maybe.
I realize those days are past. Looking further abroad to the Commonwealth. I know Britain gave up some very close economic relations, was forced to give them up with New Zealand, Australia, and some others when it entered the EU, or EC, I guess it still was. And that led to some bad feeling. You're now leaving the EU. Is there hope that these relationships can become much stronger and deeper? Are you looking for bilateral treaties with, say, Australia, another with New Zealand and Canada, or some sort of grouping? How are you approaching this?
Again, these are decisions, final decisions that we take in this area, but I think the number one priority when we come to post-Brexit trade deals will be with the US, but not that far behind. You will find trade deals with some Commonwealth countries, of course, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are the obvious choices there. And then we're also very interested in doing deals with some of the bigger economies around the world, and India is an obvious candidate there, also a Commonwealth member. So I think it'll be bilateral rather than trying to do some great multilateral deal. And obviously there will be resource constraints. I mean, how many can you negotiate at once? But these will all be high on the priority list.
The other big trend that we see in the world today, besides Brexit, is the return to geopolitics and great power competition. And Britain, is with, as you say, global interests, but as a middle power has to work out a relationship with China, with Russia. With Russia particularly, it seems you've had a very contentious relationship, and the Russians have sent agents to murder people on British soil. How is Britain going to approach Russia after Brexit, or just in general?
Yeah, I mean, your current relations with Russia is right. I mean, when you see people poisoned with lethal nerve agents on our soil, it's quite difficult to have a normal, good bilateral relationship, not to overstate things. So we wish relations with Russia weren't as they are, but when things like that happen, and also lots of other things that we disapprove of or disagree with Russia, Ukraine, which erupted again over the weekend, is just one example. But there are lots of aspects of Russian behavior we take issue with. So the relationship isn't good. We've expelled a number of Russian diplomats, and they've expelled some Brits. We had good reason to, they didn't. And so we're in a place where we're pretty small in terms of embassies as well. We would like to have better relations with Russia. We would have important commercial and economic and trading interests. They're big players on the global energy scene. They are big players internationally. They're permanent members of the UN Security Council. But that's not possible while Russian behavior continues on the lines that it does. So things are not going to change for us in terms of relations with Russia, though we will keep the channels open and we will keep talking to them until their behavior changes. And that's just the sad reality.
With China, situations may be more complex. That the relation in some ways the bilateral relation, at least to an outsider, looks better, but there seem to be some emerging points of contentiousness there. Britain has stepped up its participation in the South China Sea, in the South Pacific, and it seems to be announcing an intention to build up its presence in the Pacific.
On relations with China, they have been on a steady and significant path of improvement for some years now. When I worked as National Security Advisor in David Cameron's first administration, that's when we started this upward trend. In my time in that job, it culminated in David Cameron taking 300 businessmen on a 3-center week-long tour of China with, some very memorable visits and meeting President Xi and this kind of thing, and it's continued since then. And we believe very strongly that the way forward with China is centered on engagement and participation in the Chinese economy. And our exports are doing very well there, though it's not just about commercial activity, but they were up, I think, 22% last year. So there's a lot that is good and strong and growing about the UK-China relationship. All that said, what we do in the South China Sea is not intended as a kind of provocation to China. It's about exercising internationally recognized rights of freedom of navigation. And we will continue to do that because that's part of the international order, and if our ships have a right to sail through on certain routes, and they're going to do that. And as I say, it's not intended as a provocation, just as an expression of our support for international law. There are issues about China's trade practices, notably around intellectual property, where we share the concerns very much of the U.S. administration, and where we would like to see changes. We are always talking to the Chinese about Hong Kong, where basically the deal that we did a couple of decades ago on Hong Kong has worked well, but we keep watching it and keep ensuring that it's lived up to in both the letter and in spirit. So it's not a kind of monochrome, wonderful relationship. There are issues and problems, as there are in all bilateral relationships, but basically we feel in a good place with China.
There has been some commentary from Hong Kong that the one country, two systems agreements are working less well, and that Hong Kong's distinctive position is being eroded. Is that a concern?
No, I don't
feel in the
think.
UK?
I mean, again, I'm not a massive expert on Hong Kong, but my impression is that we think basically one country, two systems is working well, and that our Chinese partners are living up to the deal that was done 2 decades ago. Yes, there are issues sometimes, and that's why we are talking basically all the time to Chinese administration about Hong Kong, but we think it basically works well. And I mean, if you look at Hong Kong now, it is thriving. It is a real center of entrepreneurship and enterprise and commercial strength. I think the judiciary are notably independent there. So it's not perfect, but it's pretty good.
Let's turn quickly to the Middle East, and then I will invite the audience to ask some questions. At least from where I sit, it looks as if the most important trend in the Middle East today is the kind of decline of Arab power. We see a number of Arab states have been torn by contention. There are countries like Syria, that was once a sort of bastion of Arab nationalism, is not in control of its own territory, has foreign forces present. The Gulf monarchies are looking at long-term declines in oil revenue and rising population, a number of trends that have them worried. Britain has a long history of engagement in this part of the world, and a lot of relationships that go back for, in some cases, centuries. Do the Greeks have any advice for the Romans in this particular part of the world?
Yeah, look, that's a very big picture assessment, and what you've described is quite a compelling view of what is happening in the Arab world. And obviously, I remember being in Brussels as the EU ambassador when the Arab Spring happened, and I remember the hope that was around in the Western world then that this was something of a fresh start for Arab nations and would lead to great things. And if you look at Libya and Syria in particular, that's not how it's worked out. So, as I say, there's quite a lot in your picture. But look, for us, it's still a hugely important part of the world where, as you say, there is a lot of British history. A lot of those lines that are disputed around the Arab world, we drew. So people keep reminding us of that, which is nice of them. And our bilateral relations particularly with the Gulf countries, but also with some of the countries of North Africa and the Middle East, are very, very important to us. We put a huge amount of Foreign Office resources into them. I mean, if you want to look more optimistically at things, whether some of the things that are happening in the Gulf in particular, in terms of more liberal ideas gaining hold, may be a good sign for the future. In terms of oil reserves running out, well, yes, but quite a long time in the future. So these are still countries that will have a big say on world energy supplies in the future. In both in Syria and in Libya, we are part of international community that's trying to work hard to re-establish security and peace and political processes there, and we will continue to put a lot of resources into that. But it's a tragedy what's happened in both those places, especially the loss of life and the destruction of Syria. I remember my friends in the Foreign Office who learned Arabic and specialized in the Arab world, used to think that Syria was just the best posting you could have. And it's a tragedy where the state that country now is in, and question whether it is now retrievable, but we must try.
We have some young people in the audience and some others watching on CNN. Do you have any advice for young people who are curious about the UK, would like to follow UK news and learn more about the UK? What should they read? What should they do?
Do you know, there are so many more ways of following current events and following news now than there used to be. I've kind of got used now to news apps and to doing stuff online, but I'm still old-fashioned enough to prefer to get a newspaper in my hands and read all that stuff. But nowadays, when I wake up in the morning far too early, the first thing you look at is there's a Politico early morning kind of news summary, and there's a CNN one, there's a Washington Post one, and then there is the excellent Axios stuff as well. So you have to go through all of that before you get a proper newspaper in your hands. But there are so many ways of following what's going on in Britain now that young people will know more options than I do. I still think the BBC and the BBC websites are an extraordinarily the BBC is a wonderful institution, and what they do is great, and they're so objective and fair in their coverage. But in an age when there is a lot of criticism of the media, I think the British newspapers are great as well, and I try and read all of them. I can see one or two of the journalists represented at the back there. I think you're great guys.
Okay, he likes them all. All right. Okay, any questions from the audience at this point? Yes, ma'am. You? Please wait for the microphone. Please introduce yourself, and please make your question short.
Thank you, Ambassador. Eun Cho with the Voice of America. U.S. and U.K. diplomats held a meeting in London 10 days ago with maritime insurance companies and commodities traders to seek ways to prevent North Korea's illicit ship-to-ship transfers and ways of evading UN sanctions. What is the scope of UK and US's cooperation in helping block North Korea evading sanctions? And what is UK's position to the calls for easing sanctions on North Korea at this time, as called for by South Korea, Russia, and China, at a time when North Korea didn't take any significant denuclearization steps?
Okay, I think we have the question.
Yeah. Look, we basically strongly support US policy on North Korea. We think that it is dangerous for international security for North Korea to have a military nuclear program. We want to see denuclearization there. And it's clear to us that sanctions have been an important element in bringing North Korea to the table. But so far, you've had a historic summit between the two presidents, but we haven't seen yet real denuclearization happen in North Korea. And until we do, we think that sanctions need to continue. We have an embassy in Pyongyang, and so we know a bit about what is happening in the country, and sanctions are certainly having an impact. That policy has to continue until the North Koreans deliver what they have promised, which is to end their military nuclear program. And yes, we do cooperate a lot with the US administration on these issues. And if you get denuclearization, we will cooperate on that as well, because we have some expertise in these areas, but we're not there yet. So while we're not there, sanctions are the right policy, and we will support and help to make them effective.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Carl Gollivan, excuse me, you mentioned books that would be recommended to the young people. I've recently discovered a British journalist during the 30s, 40s, up till early 50s, Douglas Reed, who was very renowned internationally until he wrote, in particular, a book, The Controversy of Zion. Also, he wrote a book about American history titled Far and Wide.
What's the question?
Yes. What are your thoughts about Douglas Reed? He should be well known to you and to Britain. He's been a bit demonized, but I think young people may value his writings.
Yeah, this is going to sound horribly ignorant of me, but I've not read any of his books. And so I don't know, I'm afraid. The best book I've read recently is called Hello World. And it is about a book about the impact. It sounds very kind of technical. It's actually beautifully written and very easy to understand for a non-expert like me. It's about the impact of algorithms across different areas, whether medicine or driverless cars or well, a whole range of different things. And if you want an introduction, if you want a recommendation on a book worth reading, maybe all the modern generation understand all this stuff and didn't need to know about it. But for me, this was the best piece of learning I've done in recent months.
Thank you. In the back here.
Hello, thank you very much for coming. It's very, very lovely to see you again. I've got actually three quick.
And your name?
I'm sorry,
one question, please.
Cynthia Butler.
Choose one.
So you mentioned the Irish border, right? So the question is, do you know what it says in this particular deal regarding it? Is it a soft border, hard border? And is there a likelihood that if this doesn't pass, that there would be a re-referendum, for a national re-referendum if this isn't passed? Do you know what I'm saying?
I mean, yes, on
Irish border and second referendum.
So
if
that's
there
actually-
is, I mean, I think a second referendum is extremely unlikely, given that both of the main political parties in Britain are opposed to it. So I don't see how you get from where we are now with a deal on the table that invites people to support it or not support it to a second referendum, which would need a new act of parliament. I just don't see the process that takes you there on that. On the Irish border, look, as I said earlier, I just think that the Prime Minister has gone along as far as she possibly could to deliver her promise on no hard border in Northern Ireland. And that's why you have, basically, it's part of the reasoning behind this implementation period, when we basically have a customs arrangement that will be similar to the customs union during that 19 months until the end of December 2021. And if we don't get, 2020, and if you don't get by then the trade deal, then you have the backstop. And I mean, that is as much as you could possibly have asked of her to ensure that people have confidence that she's delivered on her promise. And we are not going to jeopardize all the achievements of the Good Friday Agreement and beyond that by reimposing controls on the Irish border. We're just not.
Thank you. Yes, lady here. Yes. Pass it.
Hi, thank you. Hannah Monican, Inside U.S. Trade. I just had a quick follow-up on sort of U.S. U.K. trade relations post-Brexit. I know that you've said that you want the U.S. And U.K. to be aligned closely with the EU, but also be able to have a free trade deal with the U.S. And I was wondering if there's any sense yet how both of those things can be true, considering sort of the U.S.'s sort of opposing regulatory regime from what the EU does, and the sort of customs arrangement that you will have in the interim.
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I understand why you ask it. And it goes to the core of the negotiations once we have got this Brexit deal agreed by the European Parliament, by the British Parliament, as well as the European Parliament has to agree it too. Once that deal is agreed, it's the core of the future negotiation, the one that will start, I guess, by Easter next year, though I'm not announcing that's the start of it, but that's my sort of expectation. And I think the two negotiations may run in parallel, but we will have to basically try and find a way through that keeps as frictionless the border and trade between the UK and the EU as possible, but allows us the freedom to do the kind of deal we want to do with the US. And on how we do it, another area where I'm not an expert is in trade policy, but I am assured by trade experts that we can do something that is ambitious in both directions, both towards the EU and towards the US. And of course, I trust my colleagues, so I think we can.
Okay, yes, sir.
Thank you. Bill Veal, I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. I wanted to ask you about the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement, which may be on its last legs. Britain has a nuclear force of its own. Do you see any future coordination with the European Union after Brexit on your nuclear force, or would that be done through NATO or some other channel?
Yeah. On INF, the INF Treaty, I mean, there's no doubt the Russians were cheating on it, so we understand why the administration wants to withdraw from it. On the future, we don't see nuclear weapons as an issue for the EU. Actually, it's questionable whether defense at all should be an issue for the EU, but we have supported a limited European kind of defense initiative designed to do things in parts of the world or activities which NATO either isn't appropriate for or doesn't want to do. But that's as far as it goes. The cornerstone of Western defense, and in terms of any coordination around our own nuclear deterrent activity around it's whether it's a bilateral issue for us and the Americans or it's something that we would be talking about in NATO, that's where it is. It's not for the EU.
Yes, sir. Your microphone is coming.
Hi, I'm Mark Melto with a foreign policy journal called Providence. My question is about the UK military and their ability to exert influence without much support from the US. If the US is going to withdraw, could the UK do a forward operation for an extended period of time?
Yeah, I mean, when I was National Security Advisor, we were just on the back of a security and defense review, a new strategy, in which the objective was to be able to do the target for our collective armed forces, be able to do two foreign interventions simultaneously. And I think I know that is still the objective. We have just built the two biggest, one is actually doing trials off the east coast of eastern seaboard at the moment. The other one hasn't yet set off on its sort of tests and trials, whatever, but we'll do, I think, next year. So we will have the two biggest aircraft carriers, the Royal Navy, two biggest ships the Royal Navy's ever had. Add to that the tens of billions of expenditure I talked about earlier in terms of acquiring and upgrading our equipment. Add to that a defense budget that is pegged to 2% of GDP, so as GDP rises, which it's doing, we're spending more on defense. And I mean, our capability, both the quality of it and the amount of it is improving all the time. So yes, the intention is that we should be able to do things by ourselves, but obviously the optimum for political as well as military reasons would be to do things as part of coalitions of the willing or as part of NATO or whatever. But in terms of our national capability, the intention is that we can do things by ourselves if we need to.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. This lady up here in the front. Let's bring in the mic.
Thank you, Katie Wang with NTD TV. As the G20 Summit is coming, we heard that Prime Minister May, she will join the summit as well. So can you give us some insight about what will be what's your expectation for that? Will President Trump with met with Prime Minister May, and will they talk about the trade issue or Brexit and so on? Thank you.
G20, I think the main two agenda items at the end of this week are climate change and trade, which will be interesting. It'll be quite contentious, we'll see. Of course, the bilateral that everyone is watching is the two presidents, Presidents Trump and Xi, in the margins of the plenary discussions at the G20. As it happens, the Prime Minister and President Trump will be sitting next to one another in the plenary sessions, I think, from what I know of the seating plan. So they will have plenty of opportunity to talk. I'm sure they will talk about Brexit. I'm sure they'll talk about other stuff that is going on the international scene at the moment. They spoke on the telephone just a couple of weeks ago. They speak every 2 or 3 weeks on the telephone. So it's a very strong, substantive relationship. We haven't organized, because they're sitting next to one another, we haven't organized a formal bilateral because there'll be so many informal opportunities for the two of them to interact. But I'm looking forward to hearing how the discussions go.
In the front here.
Thank you. I'm Philippe Gély with Le Figaro of France. A recent piece in the Washington Post described that the UK basically as a Trojan horse in the EU, and asserted that you might actually lose value in the eyes of the US after leaving the EU. I'd like to know your reaction to that. Thank you.
When I was doing my 15 years of EU specialization, I must say I never felt particularly horse-like, although I spent my whole time getting instructions from Washington and then relaying them to my European partners. So I never really bought that description. Look, it's up to us. We have the potential both to continue to be players in Europe in terms of cooperation on foreign policy and security and other issues, and for being, in a way, more significant international players because we have the freedom to, in foreign policy terms, to do some of our own thing when we need to. So I don't worry about influence. In the end, if we can succeed economically outside the European Union, and I believe we can, if we thrive economically, if we continue to invest in our defense and our national security and our intelligence and all the other bits of value we bring to the table, if we continue to be active in the Security Council and in NATO and in the Commonwealth and in other international fora, I'm confident about the future. But I'm confident that we can continue to cooperate with our closest European partners, including, of course, our friends in Paris and Berlin and other places, but also across the Atlantic with the US, and more widely with Beijing and Delhi and others.
Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you both so much. As an Irish-American dual citizen and an Oxford graduate, this has been really interesting. At different points in history, the personal relationships between diplomats have had a really big impact, particularly in terms of the U.S.-U.K. special relationship. When you look around the world now, what areas do you think that's most true in?
One of the strengths, this is not, I won't begin and end with I'll begin with the US, but end with the US relationship. One of the strengths however, of the US-UK relationship is, and one of the realities that one notices is, as ambassadors, just how strong the personal links are between diplomats with various specializations at various levels across the Atlantic, across the pond. So the political directors, US and UK, talk almost daily. The national security advisors talk almost weekly. Our Middle East expert, for example, Neil Crompton, talks to his American counterparts every couple of days and so on. And that makes a huge difference to how well the relationship functions and how close we are on policy objectives and on operational decisions, and means that, you know, when you ask ministers to approve actions or positions or whatever, you can tell them exactly what the US administration is thinking. Now, that's not unique to UK, US, and for example, similar relationships will exist between the British and French and German political directors or national security advisors or other experts, and more widely. So when I was national security advisor, I went off to Beijing a number of times and talked to my counterparts there. I went to Delhi and they came to the UK and talked to them and others. I even, in my time, when UK-Russia relations looked a little bit better than they do at the moment, used to go off to Moscow and talk to Putin's diplomatic advisor. And that relationship still happens because keeping those channels open is still important. But I think that the dialogue is a little less, a little more direct, and there's more problems to talk about than there were. But, you know, as a basic principle, a lot of work can be done diplomat to diplomat, and that can be really beneficial in sorting out quite a lot of the problems, though in the end decisions, I should stress, are taken by ministers and prime ministers and presidents.
All right, well, thank you very much. And that's been really helpful. I know the ambassador is on a tight schedule and Washington is a little rainy today, so we're going to try to get him out here and he can get out and fight the traffic as quickly as possible. Thank you all for coming. Thanks again to C-SPAN and others who've been watching us, and look forward. I guess our next event in this series is tomorrow, so perhaps I'll see some of you then.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you. It was great. Thank you.